Hello, today we're going to be talking about evidence of evolution. Now I'm going to start off this little chapter talking about and we're showing a picture of one of the coolest little fishes out there, and if you have a chance to look this guy up, he is totally cool. That is a coelacanth, and the coelacanth is considered a living fossil, and one of the reasons why it's considered a living fossil is because if you notice, coelacanth, if you want to look this guy up, is because it resembles a fish that existed millions and millions of years ago, in fact, at the time of the dinosaurs, and it has some really cool features. Some of them can get to be about 5 feet long, which is huge, but also what's neat about it is these fins that you can see over here, these bony fins. And in fact, these bony fins can move in almost kind of almost like our arms can move in some ways too, unlike what you'd see with fish today. These things do still exist, and you can find them off the coast of Africa and off the coast of Madagascar and Indonesia. And a lot of scientists think that this might be a really cool link between aquatic animals and land-dwelling animals. So again, just an example as we kind of look at some different evidence of evolution that we're going to talk about in this particular chapter. So these are objectives that we're going to go over in this chapter. I'll give you a second to read them all. You will see the slide show up as we do each little part. But we're going to start right now with describing how geological distribution of species relates to their evolutionary history. And our key words for this chapter are biogeography, homologous structures, vestigial structures, and analogous structures. All right, going back to Darwin. Remember, Darwin traveled on the HMS Beagle when he was young, in the early 20s, and he explored and was looking at the different nature and organisms and chronicling it in his journals. And one of the things he noticed is that when he was off the coast of South Africa, there was these islands called the Galapagos Islands, kind of shown right here. And as you notice, they have volcanoes on these islands. That's those little pits are shown there. And they're somewhat near each other, but there's enough of a distance from each other that the animals on the different islands were very, very unique. And what he noticed is that he saw that these islands were near each other had lots of different types of finches on it. So here's an example of some of the finches that you can see on these islands, and they're distributed differently on each island. And you can see that some of them have very long, narrow beaks, some of them have larger beaks, some of the birds are bigger in general compared to others, which are a little smaller, in different colors, etc. He noticed that they were all similar, but were really different based on the resources in the environment. And he thought to himself that maybe some of these island species had evolved from a single mainland species, so the mainland would be over here someplace, that might have flown off, inhabited one island, and maybe some more flown into different areas, and they kind of changed as they go to the different islands and adapt for the island species there. And that leads us to that term, one of our vocab words was biogeography. Basically, that's saying that the patterns of how the fossils are distributed in living species combined with information from geology, can tell us how modern organisms evolved from their ancestors. Another piece of evidence that Darwin used was looking how fossils could help document the descent of modern species. Again, at the time that Darwin was doing a lot of his research, lots of people thought the Earth was very, very young. They only thought it was a few thousand years old. But there were some people Hutton and Lyell, that were looking at evidence that the Earth was much older than that. And in fact, more evidence came about with things like radiological testing and showed that the Earth was about 4.5 million years old. So not a few thousand years, but millions of years. That gave enough time for evolution to occur. The other thing that was also fitting into this was that people were finding fossils, but they didn't realize that they were that old. So the fossils started to become found and recognized what they are. And there was definitely imperfections in the fossil record because it was still new, but they were trying to look at it overall. And they showed that, some species might be related to an older species. The historical records are incomplete, but the evidence that they have do tell a great story of evolution. And I'm going to show you one of our modern whale, how it evolved from an ancient species. It looks very different from what we consider a whale today. If you look at some of the fossil evidence of what we have for even the modern whale, we can see that there seems to be an ancient ancestor called the Artiodactyl, shown here. And again, looks very, very different from the whale. This species had legs that would walk on land, long tail shown here, kind of forward-looking face. But if you kind of look over time as they start to change, you can start seeing some species like this one over here, where we're getting shorter legs, more wider feet. It definitely has a larger snout, some nice teeth in there. But that could show that it was used to able to swim in shallow water and walk on land. While we have this particular species, again, the legs getting shorter. We're seeing that it spent probably most of its time in the water. Look at these early species. They have features that can help support living on land and shallow water. It kind of reminds me a little bit of how alligators look in some ways. Maybe this guy kind of reminds me of an alligator. And as we move along, you can see that their hind legs are getting much, much smaller. So this particular species was probably swimming the whole time. And we keep on getting to what we now see as our dolphins and whales that we see here. The back limbs are minimized, that eventually we can find them as little tiny buds almost. And they also have small pelvic bones, I don't think they showed it in your book better, that doesn't have any function in modern whales. So these are some of the evidence of evolution that Darwin had used. Can you list these evidences of evolution overall? Hopefully you're able to say that some of the evidence were things like biogeography and and fossil record. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the more modern evidence of evolution. Darwin really just had this resources available to him. As science has gotten older and more advanced technologies, more evidence can come from different sources. And that's what we're going to talk about right here is homologous structures and how they're similar in development suggests that they're involved with evolutionary change. So let's look at this for a second. Here we have an ancient lobed fin fish, not unsimilar to maybe the coelacanth that I showed in the beginning. If you notice, and I'm wondering if you can figure out, so we have other animals here like the frog, alligator, chicken, and a horse. And it has highlighted in blue these bone structures. What do you think those blue bone structures, like what part of the body could they represent? Were some of you guys able to say fingers? Hopefully you were able to. And what's neat about that is that you were able to figure that out because they kind of look like our fingers, don't they? Especially the alligator and the frog. Chicken, maybe a modified version of it. Definitely the horse, it's a modified version. Well, why do all these animals have these similar structures to each other? What's a logical reason for that? And that kind of brings us back to the evolution, that at some point, all of these animals were related to something that had that same feature that eventually got adapted and modified so it would better fit the adaptations that were needed. At the same time, not only homologous structures something that helps support evolution, but we also have things called vestigial structures. See this cute little skink over here? This is a dotted line robust slider. And I don't know if you notice, it's not a snake per se. It's a different species. It's called a skink. But I don't know if you see that little limb right there. That's a vestigial structure. This skink was adapted, or not adapted, but came from another animal that had legs. It didn't really need the legs anymore. And so it eventually made a smaller structure that had no usage for this particular animal. That's your vestigial structure. It's something that has no current usage in the animal. The whale having a pelvic bone is another example of a vestigial structure. The whales don't have legs. They don't need a pelvis bone to attach the legs. So that's something that's vestigial. Just as a reminder, vestigial structures are not structures that can be removed and keep you alive. A lot of times I'll ask someone, what's a vestigial structure? And they'll say the kidneys, because they know you can give someone a kidney and still be okay. But that's like saying your arm is a vestigial structure. You can remove an arm and still be okay. The kidneys, your arms, those things have a job in your body, and yes, you can go on without one of them, but they're still important jobs to have. Something like our tailbone is a great example of a vestigial structure. We have a tailbone, but there's no job for it to do. Now, we don't want to confuse homologous structures to analogous structures. Analogous structures are structures that are similar, but they really have different ancestries, and we can see that based on some of how they're made or how they're utilized. They have evolved independently, but do the same purpose. Examples of this is something like an insect wing. Insect wing is used to do what? Hopefully help the insect fly. Birds have wings and bats have wings. And both the birds and bats' wings help those organisms fly. But if you look at how the insect wing is made, how the bat wing is made, and how the bird wing is made, you can see that they have different evolutionary histories. And so even though they all have the same job, helping the organism fly, they showed up differently from each other, and they have different different evolutionary histories. Another piece of evidence of evolution that we have today that Darwin didn't have is things like similarities in embryology. Here we have 5 different species of embryos. And if you notice, they're very similar to each other, besides the color being different. I mean, if I asked you, what animal is this, or this, or this, or this, I bet you couldn't tell me. I will tell you, though, that one of them is a human, one of them is a chicken, one's a salamander, one's a tortoise, and one is a fish. Can you figure out which is which? All right, let me give you those answers. Were you correct? The thing is why do all of these animals have very, very similar embryos if they don't have a similar embryonic history or evolutionary history? So, for example, why do we have a tail and gill slits? Well, at one point, we might have had an evolutionary ancestor that needed it, but as we developed, we don't, and so eventually we get rid of those as we develop into a human. One thing that Darwin definitely didn't have was current molecular biology, or even the knowledge of what DNA was. At Darwin's time, they did not know that DNA was the genetic information, but we know that a little bit more today. And we can use genetics and molecular biology to help track the process of evolution. So again, we're looking at one particular protein in species. This protein is called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein that helps us carry oxygen. So as you can see, it's used in a lot of organisms. It's pretty important. And we're going to look at the protein. We're going to look at the amino acid sequence. There's 146 amino acids that make up hemoglobin. And when you look and compare these amino acids, you can notice that there's very little difference between some of our closest relatives compared to others in the hemoglobin molecule. So, for example, if you compare human hemoglobin to itself, it's exactly the same. That's understandable. But if you compare the gorilla hemoglobin to human, there's only one amino acid different. The rhesus monkey has 8 different amino acids compared to human. A mouse, which is also further related to us, is 26 amino acid out of 146 different. Chicken has 45 out of 146 that are different. And the frog has 67 compared to humans that are different in the amino acid sequence. And again, this kind of helps us place how closely related different species are to each other based on how much the DNA or the protein structures are the exact same. Now, some people think that evolution is not occurring anymore, or it stopped, or we can't really test evolution. But in fact, there's actually a great experiment that's been going on for 40 years. It's still going on. That's actually looking at evolution. And they're looking at the evolution of those finches that Darwin first saw on the Galapagos Islands. So this study is work from Peter and Rosemary Grant. And what they did is they went to the Galapagos and they looked at one little island, and they just categorized and identified all the different birds on that island. And in fact, they captured, identified, and measured every bird on that island, about 400 birds over the 400 years, and included also looking at the children of these birds and recording who mated with who to produce which babies, etc. So they've been doing this for a long time. And you can see that they categorize different types of the birds. We have the ground finches shown here. They have long needle nose kind of beaks used to get insects, fruit, nectar. You have this other ground finch that it instead has a shorter, thicker beak that's kind of like used like wire cutters. It gets a strong pressure and cutting force, so you can imagine, get thicker seeds. This tree finch, again, it's almost like a pair of pliers and how it is used to get the bark from the plants. And then this other tree finch over here, again, like a needle nose plier to kind of get, or forceps to firmly grasp small objects. So they're able to measure the different types of birds, but they also looked at the types of seeds and the hardness of the seeds. Because as you can see, this bird likes hard seeds. This one probably not as hard, but this one's going to have harder food also based on its beak. And as they did their data, they actually had some really interesting results. So this is some of their data. One thing that happened, and they did not control this at all, was there was a drought that occurred. Now, a drought is when there's no water or not enough water on the island. And when that drought occurred, what they saw was the number of seeds, that's shown here in the red line, went down a lot during that period of the drought. Notice that abundance went down. The other thing that they saw is that period of the drought, not only did the number of seeds go down, but the seeds that remained were larger, and they tend to be harder too. Okay, so that was in 1976 to 1977. At that same time, as you can imagine, with the population, because less seeds, what's going to happen is you're going to see less birds also. The ground finch population went down also. And the birds that were able to survive, when they measured those, notice what happened to their beak size. The ones that ended up surviving, their beak size increased quite a bit. In fact, it was a significant difference. Those with the largest beak size survived because, as you can see, the hardness of the seeds increased. Larger beaks able to get to those larger seeds. So that was a really great experiment that's still going on, testing how the evolution changes in the species. And it really is based on the environment at that time. Well, I hope you had a chance to go over all the learning objectives that we did. We describe how geological distribution of species today relates to the evolutionary history. We've identified how fossils help document the descent of modern species. We explained what homologous structures and similarities in development suggest about the process of evolutionary change. Describe how modern biology can be used to trace the process of evolution. And explain what recent research on the Galapagos finches showed about natural selection. Additionally, we went over the words biogeography, homologous structures, vestigial structures, and analogous structures.